Yao Jin Jiao, Yao Jin Jiao. Ladies and gentlemen, the Jews of China. 1939 in Austria, a guy goes into a travel agency and he says, look, I gotta get out of the country. Hitler is not being very ambiguous. It's rather clear that things are not going to be very good for the Jews here, so I've got to leave. Travel agent says, okay, my friend, always happy to do business. Where would you like to go? He says, I don't tell you the truth, I haven't thought about that. I just figured that I have to leave, go someplace. Where do you recommend? Travel agent says, it's not my business to recommend. You tell me where you want to go. I'll arrange the necessary papers. I'll take care of the travel documents. I'll be your one-stop travel agency. Fellow says, all right, can I see a globe? Looks at the globe, looks around Europe, says, I have a brother-in-law in France. Could you get me into France? Says, France? I would not recommend France for a Jew these days because it seems quite likely that Hitler will conquer France. Conquer France? Well, all right. He looks around a bit more, goes from the orange into the yellow over to the blue, crossing boundaries. How about Holland? I've heard good things about Holland. So tell you the truth, my friend, but it seems that Hitler may conquer Holland, in which case you would be back in the same trouble that you're in now. He says, wow, decides he's going to go off to a distant land. He's going to pick the United States. How about the United States? He says, well, the United States is not accepting any more Jews. They have a very strict quota, and the quota has been filled for this year, so they're not taking any more refugees. So it's not, finds big country down under. Says, Australia? Well, Australia recently announced that they have no racial problem, and therefore they're not desirous of importing one. Australia would not be your best choice. So he picks this country, that country, every country he tries out. Travel agent says, not recommended, can't work. Finally, the Jewish guy looks up, exasperated, and with a look of a little bit of hope in his eyes says, maybe you have another globe? Well, interestingly, the way the joke could have ended, and this was a joke, by the way, the way the joke could have ended was with the guy end up going to China, which was the least likely of all places. I mean, if you think that India is a far-out Jewish community, you ain't seen nothing yet. China is a far-out Jewish community. As a matter of fact, let me first tell you about China of today, even though that's not the intent of this lecture, but you should realize how exotic it is for a Jewish community to thrive in China. And we're not only going to talk about these Jews who went there during World War II. There is plenty more to speak about the Chinese Jewish community, as you will see in a moment. But first of all, China today. China has a very small number of Jews. Now, not only small by China standards, but small by any standards. There are today in China a grand total of 3 synagogues. That's it. There is a Chabad Lubavitch, which is really saying the same thing, but some people may know the term as Chabad, others as Lubavitch. There is a Chabad Lubavitch Orthodox synagogue in Shanghai. There is a Chabad Lubavitch Orthodox synagogue in Beijing. There is a Reform type synagogue, not officially affiliated with the Reform movement, but a quote-unquote liberal type synagogue in Beijing. And that is all. And I'll tell you, I know of some synagogues in Borough Park that within the course of one Shabbat, within the course of one weekend, you end up having one synagogue turn into 3. And certainly if you go to Jerusalem and you go to Mea Sha'arim and some other neighborhoods in Jerusalem and around Israel, and you find Shtiblach. Shtiblach is essentially a minyan factory. You can go in there anytime, day or night, and there are people gathering together to pray. Within the space of one building, sometimes you can have 10 different prayer services going on. I mean, 10 is really like the max that you could get, because how big, after all, can a building get? But that's extraordinary. And here we're talking about all of China, only having 3 synagogues. These synagogues, by the way, cater not only to the local Jewish communities, as you would imagine, but they cater as well to a great many travelers and business people. China today has the fastest growing economy, which is pretty common for a country coming out of communism, still technically communistic, but coming out of communism. And there's plenty of business people traveling through. But with all the business people, and with all the residents, and with all the travelers and tourists and whatnot, this past high holiday season, between the 2 Chabad synagogues, and the Reform synagogue, and the Israeli consulate, all of which were having high holiday services, not to mention high holiday celebrations with food. Obviously, we don't refer here to Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, when eating is not advised. We're referring to Rosh Hashanah. Nevertheless, with all of these 4 celebrations together, they did not manage to get 1,000 people. Quite a few less. They only got a few hundred people at all 4 celebrations. Not at all the fault of any of these organizations. It just happens to be that China is not a place where Jews live, strangely enough. I would think that maybe more Jews would live in China because it has been, historically, rather hospitable to Jews. Perhaps not under Mao, but in earlier times, and hopefully in future times. We'll see what the future holds. But today, China, the most populous country in the world, has a grand total of about 1.3 billion people living in the country. Out of this 1.3 billion people, how many do you reckon are Jews? Only about 200 people in the entire country, give or take 100. that goes to mean that for every Jew that you're going to come across in China, he or she is representing another 5 to 10 million Chinese. That is the lowest percentage per capita any place in the world, and I'll include Saudi Arabia for as long as they allow American military and intelligence personnel into the country. Otherwise, of course, with Saudi Arabia being officially Rudner, Saudi Arabia would win. But China is really just 1 out of every 10 million people or so is Jewish, and that is the lowest rate that you're going to find. But as I mentioned, it wasn't always so. The Jews who ended up in China during World War II made up an extraordinary story. There are heroes in the story, but I don't want to get too much in depth because we want to travel back even earlier. But to tell you about this story in brief, which you should certainly know, it started in about 1937, when a great many Jews from Germany and Austria started making their way out to Shanghai. At the time, you did not need a visa to get into Shanghai. And if you are a refugee, God forbid, the kind of place that you're looking for and that seems to you to be the promised land is a place where you do not need a visa to enter. Unfortunately, Britain was closing the real promised land. What with the Peel Commission, which was a very interesting commission, I don't want to get into too many details on it, but the Peel Commission essentially came to the conclusion that the Arabs were causing riots and they were killing Jews, as well as British. They were killing people because they didn't like the fact that more Jews were coming to Israel. Therefore, the logical conclusion to come to is to stop the Jewish immigration, or to drastically slow down Jewish immigration. Originally, the Peel Commission had a partition plan where the Jews would get a little itty-bitty piece of Israel, the Arabs would get the rest, but eventually what it turned into, in 1939, the White Paper closed the borders of Israel, except for the next 5 years, the British would allow 15,000 Jews. 1939, you recognize! They would allow 15,000 Jews in a year for 5 years, and after that, no more, unless the Arabs say it's okay. Now, some of you might be wondering how the British ended up there. I didn't want to talk about this. This wasn't the topic of today's conversation. But in very brief, the British were given Palestine, which included all of Israel and all of Jordan, which is about twice the size of Israel. They were given this area of Palestine as a mandate to hold for the Jews. Finally ratified in 1922 by the League of Nations, pretty much the only thing they ever did. It was being given to the British to hold for the Jews until the Jews could rule themselves. And it makes very clear they're not allowed to give any part of Palestine over to any other authority. But a few months later, they did give over most of Palestine to Abdullah of Jordan and did not allow any Jews to live there. But Shanghai did not require a visa. And a few years later, Shanghai became the center for refugees not from Germany and Austria, but from, of all places, Lithuania. And many Orthodox Jews from Lithuania. Not everybody who made their way to Shanghai was Orthodox, certainly not from the German and Austrian Jews, but in Lithuania the entire Mir Yeshiva made it out alive over to Shanghai, and many other Jews as well. Through the efforts of a number of people, Shanghai at the time was occupied by the Japanese, much to the unhappiness of the Chinese, and the Japanese vice consul in Kaunas, known in Yiddish as Kovna, in Kaunas, Lithuania, was Chiun Sempo Sugihara. And Chiun Sugihara handed out transit visas to a great number of Jews, thousands of people, transit visas that allowed them to temporarily reside in Shanghai. And thus, he eventually saved the lives of many, many people. One more name that I'll drop over here to give credit to, recently deceased, Rabbi Dr. Zarach Varhaftig. Rabbi Dr. Zarach Varhaftig, who later was a signator on the Declaration of Independence for Israel, and who was the second to last of the signatories to die. Interestingly, the last one to die was Mayor Wilner, the communist. But Rabbi Dr. Zarach Varhaftig understood the political situation of his day, and he made some of the connections between the Japanese and between various yeshivas and other Jewish organizations, and he did everything in his power to try and save as many people as he possibly could, and Tiyeh Zichro Baruch, may his memory be a blessing. As well, for Mr. Sugihara, the vice consul in Kaunas, Lithuania. Now, things were not that great for the Jews in Shanghai. Nevertheless, considering how much worse things would have been for them in Europe, essentially the vast majority of them would have been killed, many Jews in Shanghai then and thereafter referred to Shanghai as Shanghai, with Chai being the Hebrew word for life, because it was through getting to Shanghai that their lives were saved. But I promised you this would not be the earliest community, so let me tell you that before then, there were Jews living in Harbin and Tientsin. That, at the time, was controlled by Russia, and Russia was very interested in having her citizens move all the way out to the far, far east and populating the east, and therefore they offered incentives to people willing to move, including Jews, also including Karaites, but we'll discuss Karaites in a bit more depth later on. And these communities in the cities of Harbin and Tientsin were built up moving into the 20th century. Harbin more than Tientsin. Tientsin never really amounted to much, but Harbin ended up having a real, true Jewish community. But today, alas, the communities of Harbin and Tientsin are no more. There may be a few old Jews left there, not to mention cemeteries, remains of old Jews, but there are no Jewish communities left there. And even before Harbin and Tientsin, there was another community of Jews in Shanghai. In our discussion on the Jews of India, I mentioned the David Sassoon family. Well, David Sassoon's son, Elias David Sassoon, one of his 8 sons, moved out to Shanghai and was involved in building up a real Jewish community in Shanghai, such that by the early 1900s they had 3 synagogues in Shanghai, Sephardic synagogues, following the tradition of the Jews of the Middle East, and as well, their business was so prosperous and so successful that the Jewish business community of Shanghai ended up building or owning approximately 1/3 of the beautiful buildings of Shanghai. But like the refugee community of 100 years later, this community also is no more. The Jews of Harbin, of Tientsin, the Sephardic Jews of Shanghai, and the refugees from Germany, Austria, Lithuania, and other lands coming in the 1930s and 40s, all of these communities are gone, and today there is a new community in Shanghai, a small one to be sure, and a new community in Beijing. But even by the time that Elias David Sassoon was making his new home, him and his friends were building up businesses in Shanghai, they were the latecomers to China. There had been Jewish communities there before, and by this point in the mid-19th century, when the Sassoon family builds up the community in Shanghai, Matteo Ricci is long dead. And I'd like to speak about Matteo Ricci when he was still alive. So let's travel back to June 24th, 1605, when Matteo Ricci, one of the first Christians, really a trailblazer, to open up the Chinese world to the Europeans in modern times, Matteo Ricci is preparing for the festival in honor of St. John the Baptist.